Deep in the Ozark Mountains, where dirt roads vanish into silence, lived two sisters who made a pact no church would bless. They shared one husband, binding blood and marriage into a knot that defied law and nature. Records from Missouri's remote counties in the 1940s hint at their strange household, but the details remain buried. Were they victims of poverty or architects of something darker? Tonight, Hidden Docs pulls back the veil on the most inbred family in the Ozarks. Welcome to Hidden Docs. This is where we uncover stories too unsettling for textbooks, where forgotten families and hidden crimes rise from the shadows of history. If you're drawn to tales that unsettle, disturb, and reveal what communities tried to bury, you're in the right place. Subscribe and ring the bell to stay with us, because every week we descend into the darker side of America's past. Now let's return to the Ozark Hills, where two sisters and their shared husband lived a life that blurred the line between survival and sin. The Ozark Mountains have always carried whispers of bootleggers, feuds, and families that lived too far from town for law or church to guide them. In Shannon County, Missouri, census records from the 1930s list households where siblings lived in close quarters, cut off by rivers and ridges that kept outsiders away. For most, isolation bred resilience, but for some it bred something stranger. The story of the two sisters begins here, in a cabin of rotting wood perched on a ridge above the current river. Neighbors rarely saw them. When they did, the women were always together. One older by 2 years, the other quiet and watchful. Both carried the same angular face, the same piercing pale eyes, the same almost ghostly thinness. And then there was the man, John Henry, a farmer in name, though he barely kept livestock alive. What set them apart from the rest of the Ozarks wasn't poverty alone. It was the arrangement whispered about in hushed tones. Both sisters called John Henry their husband. When one was seen pregnant, the other would care for her. Then months later, the roles reversed. To outsiders, it seemed less like a marriage and more like a pact. Fear took hold in the small settlements nearby, not from violence, but from what their children revealed. Some were born sickly, with crooked bones and sunken chests. Others never lived past infancy. Yet the family persisted, and every new child deepened the suspicion. Midwives recorded their names in trembling handwriting, stillbirth after stillbirth, scattered among a few who survived. By the late 1940s, locals refused to let their own children near the family's cabin. There were stories of strange noises at night, screams that sounded not quite human, and cries of children that faded too quickly. Hunters swore they saw the sisters wandering barefoot under the moon, searching for herbs or berries, with eyes that glowed pale in the torchlight. But what disturbed people most was the silence of the law. County officials knew of the family. Census takers wrote down the sisters' names and listed John Henry as head of household. Yet no charges were ever filed. The Ozarks in those days operated under a simple rule: as long as no one left the ridge to cause trouble, people looked away, and so fear lingered, not only of the family's choices but of what it said about the land itself. In the Ozarks, bloodlines could twist like the tangled roots of old oak trees, and when they did, no one was certain what would grow from the soil. To understand how two sisters came to share one husband, we must step back and look at the Ozarks themselves. This wasn't just a landscape of mountains and rivers. It was a world cut off from modern America. Roads washed out every spring. Doctors were a 2-day ride away. Churches, when they existed, were small log shacks that met once or twice a month. In such isolation, the rules of kinship bent until they no longer resembled the laws of the outside world. By the 1930s and 40s, the Ozarks had already developed a reputation for insularity. Sociologists like Vance Randolph, who studied the region in the mid-20th century, noted the prevalence of cousin marriages and closed families that rarely let outsiders in. He described valleys where nearly every surname was the same, evidence of generations intermarrying. What might sound shocking elsewhere was often considered survival here. When there were only a handful of eligible men, some families looked inward rather than risk losing land or bloodlines. For the sisters, poverty was the binding thread. Their father had died in a logging accident when they were still young. Their mother raised them in hardship, relying on neighbors for food and firewood. When John Henry appeared, a man with a few acres of land and a mule, He represented stability, however meager. Marrying him was not just about love, it was about survival. And when one sister took him, the other was left with few choices. Local accounts suggest that John Henry himself encouraged the arrangement. Some whispered that he quoted scripture out of context, twisting passages to justify keeping both women under his roof. Others believed it was the sisters who agreed, fearing that separation would mean one of them starved or was forced into labor in another county. Whatever the truth, their pact blurred the line between necessity and taboo. The cycle deepened with children. Each birth tied the sisters more firmly to John Henry's household, and each child, whether living or lost, was a reminder that leaving was impossible. Even when sickness swept through the Ozarks, taking infants in alarming numbers, the sisters stayed. Their lives revolved around tending the land, nursing the sick, and protecting the fragile structure they had built. The wider community's silence also played a role. In towns like Eminence and Birch Tree, gossip circulated, but intervention never came. Families there lived by a code. You didn't shame your neighbors unless they harmed you directly. This was the unspoken law of the hills. Keep to your own ridge and let others do the same. And so reason and fear intertwined. The sisters' choice, if it can be called a choice, was born from circumstance as much as desire. In a land where every ridgeline meant another barrier to the outside world, what looked like sin to others could masquerade as survival to those trapped within it. The result was a family that stood as both a warning and a mirror, showing what happens when isolation hardens into law and when survival is paid for in blood. By the early 1950s, the strange household on the ridge was no longer just a whisper. Children from nearby farms began returning with stories that chilled their parents. Some claimed they saw siblings from the family, thin, wide-eyed and speaking in halting words, wandering the woods barefoot. Others swore that one boy's face seemed twisted, his jaw set at an odd angle that made him look more animal than human. For years, locals had tolerated what they saw as a shameful secret. But now the evidence walked on two legs. Teachers in the one-room schoolhouse grew uneasy. Attendance records show that 3 children from the family were enrolled briefly, then vanished from the rolls. When asked, John Henry told neighbors they were needed at home. The truth, some whispered, was that their odd appearance made them targets of ridicule. The sisters chose to keep them hidden, further isolating the family. The breaking point came with sickness. In 1952, a fever swept through Shannon County. Families buried infants in unmarked graves, and doctors from St. Louis were called in to track its spread. When they reached the ridge where the sisters lived, they found 2 graves freshly dug, with wooden crosses leaning against the earth. Neither bore a name. The visiting doctor, a man named William Leach, filed a report noting the deaths. In his notes, he described the household as peculiar, with family ties unclear and the children physically underdeveloped. But after recording it, he moved on like so many before him, unwilling to confront what lay in the hills. Still, his words marked the first official record of what outsiders had long suspected. By then, the family was firmly bound by secrecy. The sisters had grown older, their faces hardened by labor and loss. John Henry drank more heavily, often disappearing for days to gamble or trade in town. Rumors spread that arguments echoed from the cabin at night, fights that carried down the ridge like thunder. Yet every morning the sisters appeared side by side, tending to the chores as if nothing had happened. Neighbors began to fear them in a new way, not just for the sickness or the children's deformities, but for the sense that they were untouchable. Hunters who crossed too close swore the sisters watched them from the trees, silent and unmoving. Women in town muttered that their bloodline was cursed, that God had turned his face away. But the true climax was yet to come. In the winter of 1953, a fire broke out in the cabin. Smoke rose over the ridge, and by the time neighbors arrived, the roof had collapsed. John Henry was found alive, stumbling in shock, but 2 children lay dead inside. The sisters, badly burned, survived, but their household was forever broken. The fire was reported in the current local newspaper, buried on the back page under the headline, "Tragedy Strikes Rural Family." It mentioned no names, no details, just that a blaze had claimed young lives. Yet for those who knew the whispers, it was confirmation of what they had long feared. The family's pact had led not only to sickness and secrecy, but now to death in plain sight. From that moment, The sisters' story passed fully into legend. Some said the fire was an accident, sparked by a lantern. Others believed it was judgment, a punishment for defying both law and scripture. And still others claimed John Henry set it himself, eager to escape the burden of a family too strange for even the Ozarks to contain. Whatever the truth, the fire marked the end of their hidden world. And with it, the community could no longer pretend not to see what had festered in the shadows of their hills. The fire should have ended the story. In many ways it did, but the sisters lived on, scarred and bound tighter than ever by what they had lost. Their cabin, reduced to ashes, became a symbol of everything the community feared but refused to confront. And yet in the silence that followed, the legend only grew darker. After the tragedy of 1953, John Henry drifted away. Some say he left the Ozarks entirely, taking up work as a farmhand in Arkansas. Others whispered he was seen in town years later, gaunt and broken, mumbling that he had lived with 2 wives but never had peace. His disappearance left the sisters alone, 2 women, middle-aged and marked by fire, clinging to what remained of their family. But it was the children who carried the weight of the story. Those who survived the blaze grew into adulthood under the shadow of their origins. Census records from the mid-1950s still list the family name, though the exact relationships are impossible to trace. Some of the offspring moved west, seeking anonymity in St. Louis or Kansas City. Others stayed in the hills, their surnames reappearing in county ledgers like faint echoes. Neighbors said you could spot them by their eyes, too pale, too piercing, as if the mountains themselves had carved their faces. For the wider community, the fire became a dividing line. Before, people turned their heads, whispering but never acting. After, they spoke of the sisters with a mix of pity and dread. Church sermons in nearby towns used them as a cautionary tale, a warning about the dangers of sin and secrecy. Children were told never to wander too far, lest they stumble upon the ridge where the cursed women once lived. The legend hardened in the telling. Some claimed the sisters had turned to witchcraft after the fire, using herbs and charms to heal their wounds. Others believed they were punished by God, condemned to wander the hills in spirit long after death. Still others said the bloodline lived on, hidden in plain sight among ordinary families who carried the stigma quietly, never admitting where their kin had come from. The truth, as always, was stranger and sadder. County records show that one sister died in 1961, buried in an unmarked grave near the current river. The other lived until the late 1960s, her name scrawled in a death ledger, with no mention of children or spouse. They passed not as witches or demons, but as women whose lives had been defined by choices no one outside their ridge could understand. Yet even in death, the fear remained. Hunters in the 1970s swore they heard laughter on cold nights near the burned-out ridge, the voices of 2 women rising and falling like echoes in the trees. Locals told travelers not to camp near the ruins, saying the land itself had soured, cursed by what had happened there. And so, the sisters' story became part of the dark folklore of the Ozarks, a tale told in hushed tones, half warning and half memory. It was never about monsters or spirits, but about something far more unsettling. What happens when isolation twists the rules of family until nothing familiar remains? The sisters shared one husband. They shared children. They shared tragedy. And in doing so, they carved their names into the hidden history of the hills. The story of the sisters who shared one husband is not just about a single family, it is about the Ozarks themselves. A land where rivers cut communities apart, where poverty pressed hard, and where silence was often easier than confrontation. Their lives remind us that darkness doesn't always come in the form of crime or violence. Sometimes it hides in quiet cabins, in choices made behind closed doors, in secrets passed from one generation to the next. For decades, their names have been lost in fragments of census records, in yellowed newspapers, in the fading memories of those who once whispered about the cursed women on the ridge. Yet their legacy endures in the folklore of the mountains, a reminder of what happens when isolation blurs the line between survival and sin. Here at Hidden Docs, we search for these buried histories, not to sensationalize them, but to preserve the lessons they hold. The sisters' story teaches us that darkness often grows in silence, and that when communities look away, secrets fester until they consume everyone within reach. And so, As you think of the sisters, remember, legends are not born in faraway places. They rise from forgotten homes, from neglected roads, from neighbors no one dared to question. Sometimes the scariest stories are not found in books or movies, but in the land beneath our feet. This was Hidden Darks. If you found this story as haunting as we did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. It helps us bring more forgotten histories out of the shadows. And join us next time as we peel back another layer of the past to reveal what America tried to bury. Because the truth, no matter how unsettling, deserves to be remembered.